journey through the 4 P's of creative learning: projects, passion, peers, and play. In this conversation, we'll be talking about peers. And in talking about peers, I can't think of anyone better to talk with than my colleague Philip Schmidt, who started the organization Peer-to-Peer University. So he's definitely committed to peers. As I think about peers, I worry that too often in our culture, people don't think enough about peers when they think about learning. I think people have been influenced by sort of cultural icons like Rodin's Thinker, the sculpture of someone sitting there deep in thought. And people associate thinking and learning with the individual deep in thought. But I think there are real problems with that I think we know the best learning doesn't happen when you're just sitting there by yourself. And also when you involve other people, it's not just a matter of having someone else who delivers instruction to you. So I think we need some different models to really capture what's most important about learning. I think that's where peers come in.
Yeah.
So maybe you can tell us a little about some of the motivations behind your work with peer learning.
Sure, yeah, that's exactly the motivation. There was a period kind of where people started thinking about the internet and learning that was very focused on publishing content. So it's the open courseware movement. And people thought if they just put all these textbooks online and all the course materials, then that would lead to a democratization of learning. And everyone could now learn the things that they wanted to learn. In kind of the same way that the thinker was sitting there thinking, like we often imagine a student sitting there with a book, reading the book, and that's how learning takes place. And to me, the most exciting thing about the web was always the other people, right? So it wasn't the materials I could access, it was connecting with other people.
So it's not just access to information, but access to people.
Exactly. And so a few of us felt like the content wasn't going to be enough for learning and the social side was missing. In a way, P2P, actually, we used the term, the social wrapper around existing educational materials for a while. And so the way it worked was people got together in small groups. They met online, so they would be all over the world. And actually, the first 5 of us, we were spread out across 3 continents, and we tried to learn psychology together. So we actually went through this exercise together and really appreciated the getting to know the other people and personalities and forming a really strong social group.
And none of you had deep expertise or a lot of experience in psychology.
Absolutely, and that was actually the kind of the starting point. We were trying something where there was no expert in the room. So there wasn't a teacher that would come and teach us, but we had to make sense of this ourselves. We had to find materials online. And so peer-to-peer university groups would meet typically once a week. There would often be one person that would kind of select a set of materials to get started. So often people selected online courses from the Open University UK or from MIT OpenCourseware. But then the other people added materials to it as they met each week and they discussed what they'd learned. They got interested in new things, they changed the curriculum. Often they did little projects.
How do you see the trade-offs between, in peer-to-peer university is doing a lot of people connecting online to interact. How do you see the trade-offs between the online peer-to-peer and the face-to-face peer-to-peer?
Yeah, we started online because one of the amazing things about the World Web was you could now connect with people who were very far away from you. Yeah. So if you were interested in some obscure topic, you could find other enthusiasts who maybe were hard to find in your local environment. At the same time, there's a lot of peer learning that is very easy to facilitate in a face-to-face setting that's really difficult to do online. And even things like scheduling are hard online, and then people have technical problems. They don't pick up the same amount of cues, right? Kind of empathy is much harder online. As a result, we actually started experimenting with offline groups where the people would come together once a week at the Chicago Public Library, and then they would take online courses together. And what we found is that peer-to-peer university in the online version attracted mostly people that were had fairly high levels of education. They had reliable internet access, so they tended to be in a higher socioeconomic status. And to be fair, they probably didn't need a lot of additional education. They were going to be okay. And we were interested in broadening this model to people who maybe had fallen out of the education system, who really needed access to online courses. And so the example in Chicago showed us that the best is actually if you can meet face-to-face once a week with other people, And then together you make sense of these online materials.
But you still have access to all the resources and information online,
Yeah.
which you might not have had just
Yeah.
in the physical library, but you can then get the support from working together
Yeah.
with people. Yeah, it feels to me a really important area for future study is how we can find the right combination of face-to-face and online interactions with other people. They each serve a role, but I think there's probably still a lot for us to learn about how to mix them together in the best way.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, one really interesting question for me is, how can you get groups to gel very quickly when you don't have a facilitator there? So if you don't have a trained facilitator who can help people kind of open up and share with each other and form a good study group, how can you give people prompts or activities or tools that make that part of the experience really, really both effective but also fast? Because we found that first you have to create the social structure, then you start all the other things. But if people like each other and they want to spend time with each other, you've solved many of the hardest problems.
I know in a lot of the work that we've done in my research group, it's often been with kids, and we see the value of peer learning, whether it's kids working together on building a robotic construction on a tabletop or collaborating on projects in the Scratch online community. So we really see how kids learn a lot by building each other's work and learning with and from one another. But what are the ways in which this can continue through a lifetime as people get out to the working world? What do you see as the role of peer learning there?
Sure, yeah. I mean, most of my work has been with adults. And we did one experiment with a large financial services firm that they hire thousands of people every year, and everyone has to go through a licensing process. And in preparation for the licensing exam, they spend roughly 6 weeks really working through 1,200 pages of pretty, in my opinion, boring financial content. Others may disagree. But it's essentially rote learning. Like, you have to get through this content, and then you have to do a test at the end. It's a very high stakes test, because if you don't pass the test, you're not going to get the job. And so people study very hard. And traditionally, the way they've organized is people come into a cohort, then everyone sits in front of their computer along the outside of the room. They work through the materials. People have lunch together. So it's not discouraged to talk to other people, but it isn't really facilitated. And so we designed a little experiment where they picked one cohort that worked the traditional way, and then in one cohort they put people into groups. And it was a very small intervention, so they rearranged the furniture for the groups to sit together, and the groups had to choose a name for the group. So each group became a team in a sense. And then if they did well, then the group could get a lunch paid for by the company. So it's like minor interventions, right? You push a few tables around. And they found that the people who worked in the cohort with the teams outperformed the other cohort on every assessment, and also in the percentage of people who passed the exam. So with this really small intervention, turns out that you can see great results also in the corporate learning environment.
It was great to hear all these success stories, but there's still a lot of obstacles in the world. I think the culture is still set up in many ways to inhibit or discourage this type of peer learning. So I sometimes like to think about, if we look out to the future, how might it be different? If we really had a world that embraced peer learning, how would it really change the whole infrastructure of learning? I mean, what would you imagine in a future that really embraced peer learning fully?
I think a lot of the institutional settings would change because right now, even though we often talk about student agency and students taking responsibility for their own learning, the whole design of the experience is really, you're supposed to sit there, there's an expert who's going to teach you, and you have to follow the curriculum kind of step by step. So it's really the opposite. And so I think if we move towards more of a peer learning environment, it would break down some of those ideas of who's a teacher, who's a learner, also who's an expert, who's an amateur.
It probably also break down, it's not just expert and student, but also right now, if learners do interact with each other in a school setting, it's usually with other learners of the same age and the same grade. I think peers should be seen more broadly, that older kids can learn from younger kids and younger kids learn from older kids, or they also learn from people in the community. So breaking down those barriers as well. I think we really ultimately have to shift the way that everyone thinks about thinking and learning to get them away from that image of Rodin's thinker, of the lone individual. I think we're going to have to change the sculpture garden, so it's not just Rodin's thinker, but the thinker has to be surrounded by lots of other thinkers and doers, and they have to be interacting and learning with and from one another.
Yeah, and not only learning, because it's also pretty lonely to be sitting there and thinking. You kind of hope that his friends show up and they're like, okay, get up now, we're going for lunch. Because, you know, we've talked a lot about the learning effects, but there's also a really important, just a social effect of having friends and doing things with other people that I think is really important.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for joining for our conversation about peer learning.
Thank you.